welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ia Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hi.
Hi.
Guys, it's a robot today. Today we are continuing our series on campus novels with a critique of Donna Tartt's The Secret History. As a reminder, you can join our extended discussion on Reddit at CanonicalPod, and you can also find us on social media at CanonicalPod, all one word. We will be revealing spoilers here, so if you don't want the ending spoiled for you, check out our review episode, which was published last week. Now, are we all ready to leave the phenomenal world and enter into the sublime?
Let's do it.
That is one of my favorite lines in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's something interesting. This novel, I don't think, is as interesting from a language perspective as the others that we've read. I don't really have many lines in this novel that I really latched onto.
I think it's more functional. I don't know if it's very strong sentence to sentence, but I think it is very strong paragraph to paragraph.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It all works, but it didn't really hook onto my mind as like, oh, that's a good one. That's a great sentence, or that's a great turn of phrase.
No notes on quotes.
Zero notes on quotes.
I think it's not as evocative, even though we did spend a lot of time in our last episode talking about the mood and the atmosphere, but it's not especially evocative. There aren't a lot of very strong images.
Here's something else that I want to talk about is the kind of meaning of the story, or the biggest picture. It seems to flirt with, you could say, an overarching moral statement, but I feel like Tartt never really gets to it, and I think she avoids it on purpose. So do you think that there's something in the story besides Richard's love for Henry? Does it amount to more than that?
I think that points to something we were talking about at the end of our review episode when we were talking about where this falls on the literary commercial spectrum. Because it's sort of in the middle, it's not necessarily aspiring to say something, to make a statement, the way some literary books might. But I see it as a book that's about the deep loneliness that so many people have and search for an eventual loss of belonging. But I also don't know what it's saying about those things. I don't know that it's making a statement on those things necessarily.
I would agree with you. What do you think, James? Does it have something deep to say?
I think it motions to it, but it doesn't present enough evidence for a close reader to say one way or another. I disagree with your statement earlier a bit, Yad, where you said the core of the story is about his love for Henry, because I don't see that as the core of the story. Why do you think it's the core of the story?
I think Henry in the novel is an apex of a certain type of quality. And I think that here it's me kind of working through the question that I had set up for myself about what the moral statement or the big idea of the novel is. And I think that in one sense, Richard was looking for a certain type of lifestyle, a certain type of group of friends, and a certain type of individual identity. And he found it in Hampton, and he found it with Julian, his teacher, and he found it with Henry specifically. And for me, Henry represents the pinnacle of this thing that Richard aspires to, because there is a purity in Henry that doesn't exist anywhere else in the real world. Julian, at the end of the novel, kind of disappoints Richard because when he actually discovers the truth about Bunny's death, he runs away from it. He's thinking too much about the specifics of what this will mean to him personally and professionally, and he can't deal with it. I think that there's a substantial conversation with Richard and his French teacher a little bit earlier on, where French teacher, I think Laforge, is criticizing Julian. He says, Julian's error is that he's too specific. He focuses on just one thing, and he only sees in the world the one thing that he wants. And I think that with Henry also kind of resents Julian at the end of the novel because Julian didn't have the guts to stick with things as much as Henry thought he should have. And by that, I mean, he sacrifices himself at the end of the novel by committing suicide as the kind of the purest example of his life of the mind and his purest example of disinterest in the day-to-day realities of the world that we live in. He was willing to throw it away because he had an ideal of saving his friends and saving Richard in mind that was so powerful that he was willing to just kill himself in an instant. For me, that's why I think that Henry is really the apex of what Richard wants in the world. And I think that's why in the final scene, when you have this dream sequence where Richard sees Henry again, he still loves Henry. If he could be with Henry again, that's what he would do in an instant.
So you see Henry's suicide as a purely selfless act, that he was doing it in service to his friends.
I do. At least I think that's the way that Henry sees it, for sure. And that's also the way that Richard sees it. I think there was a part earlier than that when Richard didn't really understand Henry, and he didn't understand why Henry was sleeping with Camilla and causing all of these problems for their group. But at the end of the novel, I think he had a revelation. He understood why Henry did the things that he did. And that kind of rehabilitated Henry's image in his mind, and his love for Henry was kind of rekindled at the end.
Interesting. I had a different reading. I saw it as that he thought he knew what he was doing, that he thought he was above everything. I also read Julian's Departure a little bit differently. Julian, because he can only see one thing, he was so disappointed in discovering the truth that his world had been lost. His vision for what he had been creating in his students was just a facade. And so he did run away, but he ran away out of disappointment and knowing that he couldn't really look them in the eye anymore. I saw Henry's ending as kind of the extension of that I don't have anything left. All I have is my love of this class and Julian and the people around me, but all of that has turned to shit. So there's nothing left but to fix what little I can before all of us go down. So there is a selflessness to it, but there's also just a sadness and depressed resolve to it because there's nothing left.
My reading of it is much closer to Iad's than yours, Sam. I want to kind of zoom out a bit here and take what you posited earlier, Iad, about Henry being the core of this book. Because I think one of the interesting tensions here is the narrator, Richard, seems all in on Henry, like you said. But I think the reader is not. And that, for me, is quite interesting. The narrator, Richard, and the other characters seem to think that the murder of that farmer is totally fine. But as a reader, I think you would sort of exhale a bit and lean back and say, wait a minute. You guys killed a guy and you don't seem to care. Like, that tension to me is really interesting. And it's kind of never resolved because throughout the book, I don't think they ever really regret killing the farmer.
Yeah. Well, that's what I meant by Henry being kind of like the pinnacle of a certain type of person or a certain type of life. The reason why the reader can't really understand Henry and can't really empathize with Henry at the beginning is because he exists on another level from us and from Richard and from most things. Like, we don't know how to approach his level of existence. And because he does things like murdering people so casually, and he seems so calculated and cold, he's unpredictable in a sense. He doesn't operate by our rules. And for readers maybe like you, who don't really have any desire to change yourself and to change your lifestyle, you can't really be attracted to that sort of person. But for Richard, that's exactly what he wants. He sees in Henry an escape from the dreary, banal blandness of his life in California. And I think that this is the magic of the novel and the importance of the mood that I talked about in the last episode, that when people start being killed, it doesn't frighten you necessarily. It doesn't shock you. It's just like, well, of course, you have to kill somebody. It's part of the bacchanal. You have to do it, you know? Like, it seems reasonable because that's the vibe. That's the ambiance that Tartt has created around these people, and specifically, I think, around Henry.
Well, what I'm curious about here, a question for either one of you, is what was your actual reaction when you were reading this? Did you think that, wait a minute, this is a murder, this is morally wrong? Or did you just kind of go along with it and say, well, of course?
It was shocking.
Yeah. I was not shocked, really. When you have that kind of violence, it can go in one of two ways. It can go in these people are terrorizers and these people are dangerous and weird, or you can empathize with them. And I think that Tartt pushes us towards empathizing with Henry and that group, even though they are murderers. So they aren't villainized.
Yeah, and for me, that's what's interesting, is because the whole time I was very drawn in by the story, but at the same time, that sort of moral side of me was pulling back. That's what I really liked about the novel. There is that tension in the reader, I think. Unless the reader himself is a sociopath and can easily write off a murder of an innocent bystander, I think a reader will feel this kind of tension and think, why are they so casual?
Yeah, it definitely reminds me of this idea, I guess, from like Nietzsche, where you have the Superman who lives outside of the rules of a normal society. And I think that when I was reading the novel, I did have the feeling that Henry was as close to that type of Superman as we would have. And it would be silly to criticize Henry for killing somebody or for wanting to experience this type of experience, because it's a singular thing and there's no way to get to that type of frenzy without doing that type of action. So if you believe that there is a transcendental world outside of this kind of phenomenal world that we exist in, and there is a way to access it, then when people access it, you kind of just have to accept that those are the costs.
But that is not what Julian expected or what he wanted them to take from that. Julian's message was, yes, that beauty is terrifying and violent, but that you need to release that tension so that that explosion doesn't happen. And in Henry's case, that explosion happens anyway.
To your point, Sam, what he says is, morally, it is a civilized person's duty to find a release valve for themselves so that they don't allow violent, repressed urges to well up inside them uncontrollably.
Right. So I don't know that if they were taking that to heart, but I think the whole reason they were doing this is because of Julian and his words.
To your question, once again, Ed, about the core of the story, I really did like this Vox article that they had as part of their book club, where the writer, her name is Constance Grady, argues that the big conflict in the novel is this tension between two ideas of beauty. The first is the aesthetic of the sublime that Henry represents, but then there's also the aesthetic that Richard is interested in, which is quote, a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. And the picturesque, she describes, is an art form that was developed in the 18th century, and it kind of lies between the sublime and the harmoniously beautiful. So it's the beauty of lovely, unspoiled nature, beauty that delights without effort or fear. She says this is one of the central tensions of the novel, that there's these two competing ideas of beauty, and then you have Bunny, who doesn't have any opinion on beauty at all, and then he dies. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that this is a valid reading?
I think her reading is valid, but I think it depends on how you view Richard and his involvement in what happens in the novel. He does seem detached from everyone else, but to say that he's only interested in this kind of picturesque view of beauty, it makes him seem kind of diminished compared to Henry and the twins and Francis.
I do see him like that, though. I do think that he admires Henry for his convictions, but I don't think he's willing to go as far. He's the assistant, but he's never the chief operator, the one who actually kills anyone. Even though he seems so interested in what the Greek kids are doing, I don't think he's the kind of guy who would actually take part in the bacchanal and actually kill someone.
Well, that's true, but I don't know if it's a personal revulsion or a personal repression of those desires. I think it's more of a fact that he lives and is very bound by his financial circumstances to the real world. He doesn't have the capital to do whatever he wants, and he doesn't have the capital to not graduate from college and to just kind of do anything like Henry does. So when these wild thoughts come into his head, he doesn't reject them from any sort of considered moral stance. He rejects them just because when he does something wrong, the stakes are much higher than for Henry. Growing up with money or privilege isn't incidental to who you are. It's a huge part of who you are. So if he lived like Henry when he was growing up, he would have done what Henry did. But if he grew up like Henry, he wouldn't be Richard anymore.
Well, I think one part that might be illustrative is when he has to spend the winter and he lives in that hippie's loft and almost dies. And for him, it's an absolutely miserable experience with no positives. But when Henry sees it, he kind of attributes it to this kind of experiential adventure almost. Henry is the kind of person who wants to experience everything. Whereas I don't think Richard is. He's the kind of person who wants to experience nice things. And I think to your point, yeah, that it is related to class. I mean, you can look at it from that point of view. What it goes to, I think, is that the two of them have a fundamentally different attitude toward experiencing things and what they want to experience. I don't think that he would participate in the bacchanal necessarily because I don't think it's something that he would experience unless he thinks it'll lead to this kind of safe beauty. Like what a poor person might view a middle-class person's experience is like. Whereas Henry is the opposite. He's a wealthy person, but he's trying to experience the liminal states of what a person can experience. He's trying to push the borders as much as he can.
I think it's true for rich people to want to experience things, but the reason why it's true for rich people is because with rich people, there's always an out. You can dig yourself as far into a bad situation as you want to, but you can leave it whenever you want. And I think that's exactly why Henry is willing to do all of the things that he does.
But that kind of signals in a way that he's not really a true believer in experiencing the sublime. Because you're saying that there's always an escape route. I don't know if I agree with that. I feel like he is fully dedicated to this lifestyle. I don't think he would ever want to escape.
I guess, again, this comes back to me believing a lot in how substantial finance and economic concerns are to our lives. But I think our beliefs and who we are and so much of everything in the world is determined by money. And I don't doubt for a moment that Henry believes all of these things. But the reason why he believes these things is his class privilege.
He's able to believe these things because he's grown up not wanting for anything. There's no reason for him to worry about the outcomes because he's never had to worry about the outcomes.
Yes.
So this actually leads me into something I wanted to bring up. He had pointed out that this is a prime example and maybe the progenitor of what's called dark academia, which is this aesthetic that has been around for a while, but it's found new footing as this aesthetic that revolves around classic literature and self-discovery, and it's got this kind of gothic feel to it. And in researching that concept, I found that a number of related stories in dark academia center on working class protagonists, often or maybe even usually surrounded by upper class elites like we have here. And along with the allure of secret societies or clubs, seems to always come this hedonistic view and excess. There's this assumption of the pursuit of knowledge, but these stories then always seem to fall into deceit and corruption and violence. So what's the draw here? Is this just a desire to experience what the elite experience? This seemingly unreachable social group? Is it sour grapes when it's always steeped in self-destruction?
I think that for anyone in the middle class, it's very clear that you don't belong to the upper class, and the lives of the very rich and the very privileged always seem mysterious. And I think if we actually had the chance to live their lives, we would be shocked at how banal they are. But the imagination is such a thing that we always create more. And when we look at their lives, we say, well, what actually goes on behind closed doors at these elite institutions? And we create something just because something is more interesting than nothing. And privilege always seems to want to be undermined by people who don't have privilege. And we always want to say, well, the people who have more than I do have more because it's stolen, or the people who have more than I do use what they have in order to do bad things because they must be bad people to have so much. That, to me, I think is part of the allure. That's why these things are so often in this type of aesthetic. Not to say necessarily that in this novel the characters are totally bad people, but it's just the darkness that surrounds wealth. I think that's what kind of middle class people kind of put onto the upper class, rather than it being an actual feature of upper class life in general or in truth.
Moving on a bit from class, what's interesting is this juxtaposition. This pursuit of knowledge that you mentioned, Sam, is something that is almost universally considered to be almost holy. I don't think many people would say the pursuit of knowledge is a bad thing, but you have that juxtaposed with these sort of terrible activities that kind of drag people through the mud in a way. You know, it's like the most vile, hedonistic acts possible that are presented to us, for example, in this novel. I think that juxtaposition is really powerful. Just by having both elements, it creates this tension that's easy to explore. It's almost as if they're saying, in the light, you have this pursuit of knowledge, you know, when kids are going to class, but in the darkness, you have the baser carnal instincts that come out. And it helps that these are college students who are less inhibited, let's say. So I think that makes a natural mashup of two almost opposing forces.
The only thing I would say to qualify that is that it's significant that these people are not studying engineering. It must be something that seems particularly useless. I think that uselessness is part of the aesthetic. It's a kind of pure and transcendent form of aesthetic appreciation that is very connected to murder and carnage.
It's overly academic and overly literary.
Yeah, it's a caricature.
Yeah.
Well, to echo earlier statements, it has to be something to do with the sublime, right? It has to be holy or rarefied.
Sam, you had mentioned this dark academia is a kind of an aesthetic now that's become popular. But why do young people think that this is something new?
It does seem like there's a big resurgence now. So maybe that's part of it, that it fell away. But it seems especially pertinent that it is happening now, this year, or the last couple years, when people seem to be turning inward more, especially this year with the pandemic. There's a lot more interior life building going on. So these aesthetics that seem new to people on TikTok and Instagram that have actually been around for quite a while, I think it's seeing a resurgence because there has to be this new window into what could be, because people are locked indoors now.
Yeah, as someone who does not have TikTok on his phone, what is the dark academia aesthetic on TikTok?
Well, in all social media, I think that it's wearing a certain type of clothing and affecting a certain type of manner and being in a certain setting. So you might wear like a long tweed jacket and maybe a fedora or something, and you would stand in like a campus setting with some classical architecture behind you, and you would be looking very pensive. Maybe it would be a black and white photo. I think it's important that we note that it's an aesthetic first. It's not a genre in the sense that we would call campus novels a genre, because it's just as much about an appearance as an actual lifestyle or anything else. It's a way of dress, and I think that that's the thing that young people latch onto very easily, because they think that the way of dress is very, very stylish and handsome. And I think that that actual fashion sense is what leads them into The Secret History and other novels that belong to this group.
Now, once again, as someone who is not familiar with TikTok, I believe it dispenses moving pictures. Are these people acting? Like, are they moving? Or are they just posing? Are they doing things?
Well, it depends. I mean, it's a huge platform, but you'd have people who are posing. You'd have people who are kind of walking around in kind of a staged setting. You'd have people showing off the things that they bought online and saying, look, I bought this really cool dark academia waistcoat. Like, now you'll look exactly like Henry, or, oh, this is what Camilla would wear. You know, there's a lot of things going on online.
So I want to talk about something that we haven't talked about, which is the incest in the novel. What did you think about that? Did it just come out of left field for you? And did you think it added anything to the novel? I mean, I liked that it was in there because it certainly added to the atmosphere and to the tension. But on an intellectual, literary level, I really questioned it. Also, I could see it being in there because of the classics Greek influence. But is it anything more than that?
I wasn't totally caught off guard by it. I think it goes with what you were saying about the Greek/classical influence, but also to what Iad was talking about. These are people with money, and not that money leads to incest, but rather these are people from very different backgrounds.
The fundamental thing that makes these people different from people like us is that these are people who have seriously considered the question, why should the rules of society apply to me? They really do feel that at some level, the way that other people live and the things that other people won't do have nothing to do with them. And as readers, we tacitly understand that this is the kind of person that they are. These are the kind of people that they are. So when we find out, oh, these people are breaking one of the biggest taboos of all time, well, of course they are, because that's who they are.
Well, what's interesting is what is considered a moral transgression here, because murdering a commoner is okay, sleeping with your twin is okay, but abusing that twin is a no-no.
I don't think that there is a specific rule book that all of these characters are playing by. I think the important factor here is that all of the characters, really except maybe for Richard and Bunny, feel like they have the prerogative to make their own rule book. And so for Henry, at least it seems like abusing your sister is against the rules. But for the other characters, perhaps it's not against the rules. I think that that's really the key to this novel, is that they are the type of people who are willing to say, I can decide what's right and wrong by myself, independent from society. And Tartt is able to get you to play along with that.
I think that's really interesting how morality is fluid here. I don't know if I can play along with it necessarily, because for me, the interesting tension as a reader is I'm always pulling back. I'm always saying, hold on, wait a minute. Like, I can get titillated by this, but I am not buying in on this at all. Also, another part I find interesting, the difference between how Richard reacts to the situation and how I, as reader, react to the situation, is the portrayal of Bunny. I actually think that Bunny is the only real innocent character in all this, and he's the one that gets killed. And his name is Bunny, so, this kind of innocent creature. I think it's really interesting how she has a section where he's questioning sin, or he's asking, I think, his girlfriend before he gets killed. He's asking his girlfriend about sin and forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the few gestures we get at this question of what is actually right and wrong. Is there a fixed moral compass?
Yeah. But at that moment, he seems incredibly naive. I mean, maybe I bought into it more than you did, but his question of sin is naive in the sense that because we've gotten invested in this kind of very flexible worldview, for him to act as if, oh, well, there is such a thing as sin and there is such a thing that it's bad for everyone to do it, it seems parochial. It seems kind of naive.
I was just going to say, I don't think he's completely innocent either. If we take Henry at his word, Henry supposes that Bunny isn't upset about the murder itself, but that he was not included in it. And then later we know that Bunny's not going to the police for reasons that are speculated, but we don't fully know why he doesn't go. And like you point out, there's this naive sense that he knows he should be doing something, but what he actually does is blackmail. So he's not a goody two-shoes.
I think it depends on how you view Bunny as a character, because I think you can certainly read him as a character who's quite clever at blackmailing his friends, but I think you can also read him as a character who's really dumb.
Oh, yeah, I don't think he's clever. I think he's bumbling through everything
Right.
he does.
But, he's described as having this preternatural ability to kind of exploit people's weaknesses. But he kind of says what should be unsaid. He's the fool in the traditional dramas. So that's what's interesting is, the fool is someone who speaks truth. I think that the way Bunny is presented here is interesting because of that. I think that he is someone who potentially can speak truth. That he is someone who, by introducing this idea of sin, it is this kind of fixed morality. Even if he doesn't really mean it, it's given to us. I have a lot of sympathy for Bunny, actually. When they kind of talk about why they're going to murder him, I understand. But at the same time, I think, well, you guys are a bunch of shitheels. Like, he's the good guy in a way.
We talked about the characterization in our review portion last week. Bunny and Henry were the main focuses of that for me. For me, they were constantly bouncing back and forth. When we first meet Bunny, I felt immediately drawn to him, but he's anti-Semitic, he's homophobic, he has all of these really awful things about him, so you start to hate him. But then, yeah, like you say, he becomes this very tragic figure, and before he gets murdered, when the setup is coming, even before it's happened, yeah, you start to see all the other characters for who they really are. And suddenly Bunny once again becomes this, as you put it, innocent, this fool who speaks truth.
I think it really goes to her strength as a writer to have someone who you pity, but at the same time you think, oh, he's really odious.
Yeah.
Like your reaction to Bunny as a character kind of moves around a lot because he's very unlikable in a stereotypical way, but he's very likable in a surprising way.
Well, and then when you see his family later and it's just mirror images of him, it's a good way, even though it's slower as we talked about, it's a good way of digging that thorn into Richard's side.
I have to disagree with both of you because it seems like both of you are saying that in some sense Bunny is a likable character. For me, I found him throughout to be an unlikable character. And I think that's to do with my reading of the novel. It's not necessarily moving away from a goodness or a correctness towards doing something evil, but moving from convention to unconventional behavior. So to me, in the novel, Bunny represents conventional behavior, which I often have a pretty low opinion of. And one of the themes of the novel, if not the main theme of the novel, is when you decide for yourself that it's okay to move away from convention, if you don't have something else to ground you in, you're going to be kind of unmoored. And I think when they decide to kill Bunny and to kill the farmer, and they decide that they can do whatever they like, they have nothing to connect themselves to the real world. That, to me, is the problem. It doesn't necessarily require Bunny or conventional behavior to be good in any way.
On that happy note, we will take a break because we need it. When we come back, we'll talk about campus novels more broadly. Okay, welcome back. Let's talk a little bit now about campus novels more broadly. What do you guys want to talk about?
You guys can probably tell from our discussion, but I'm much more concerned with class than probably you guys are. Do you think that the reader needs to go to college to appreciate these types of campus novels? Is the appeal that we find in The Secret History something that makes it kind of a classist novel?
I don't think you need to go to college to like campus novels. I think it might help in a lot of cases. I don't think it's necessary with this novel. I think that's actually part of the appeal, that Richard is not of this world. He doesn't belong to this world. He wants to be a part of it, but I think that's the draw as a reader. We're not necessarily a part of that world either. It's a window to a class that we don't belong to.
Do you think that Harry Potter is a classist novel or a classist series?
No, but I don't think that it has within it the idea that everyone has gone to Hogwarts. I think with the campus novel, one of the main appeals is that it's nostalgic. It reminds you of a very formative and important part of your life. And if you haven't experienced that, maybe you won't be able to appreciate it, or you won't be able to enjoy it in the same way that somebody who did go to college would.
Do you think this book fits into that as well?
I think it presents the college experience in a way that is markedly unusual. So when they're in college and doing these things, it's not presented to the reader as like, well, this is what college life is like. It's more like, well, this is what their life was like in college. So I think anybody could appreciate it.
I think with a campus novel that you'd never really identify with it wholly. I think that what makes a campus novel good and interesting is that it gives you a touchstone that maybe you're familiar with, even on a surface level, even if you have not attended college, you have some kind of conception of what it's like. But underneath that, you have the sort of underbelly. That, to me, is what makes a campus novel a campus novel. It presents this kind of, let's say, facade or easily accessible setting that everyone thinks they know about, but there's always some secret, which makes it exclusive. So to that end, I don't think that it is necessarily classist, because I think that the draw is its familiarity, but the execution of the novel is the surprise, is how it is actually unfamiliar.
I want to return to this after the next two novels, because I don't know if I agree, but I think we need more of a survey for us to come back to.
Well, it sounds like it's time for us to stop then, because we have to start our bacchanal. So thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit, once again, at Canonical Pod, where we regularly post threads for discussion. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. That's Canonical Pod, one word. We'll be back next week with our review of Stoner by John Williams. If you're interested in following our discussion, you can go ahead and get a copy of the book. Or If you just want to listen to us first, that's fine too. You can wait a week before you buy the book and see what we think of the novel. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.